Jesus was not motivated by popularity, but rather by a holy integrity, as we see in the gospel. But is this good news? What are we to do with the conflict between Jesus and the incensed hometown crowd? What does it tell us today? How are we to grow in becoming faithful Christians in the spirit of today's gospel? Katie Hines Shaw, a Lutheran pastor in Chicago, had this conversation once upon a time in her car. She writes, "My son, about 4 years old, asked me, 'Mama, what do you want to be when you grow up?' It was a question," she writes, "he was used to hearing as a preschooler, and he tempered his answers to his audience. He wanted to be a fireman when he went to the station down the block, a gardener when the maintenance crew came by, a basketball player as we passed the teens at the park. I was used to hearing this question too, although my answer didn't change as often as his. Over the preceding years, I had explained to countless relatives, committees, and bishops that I really wanted to be ordained. Driving down the road that day, a few years into my first call, I answered my son, 'When I grow up, I think I'll still be a pastor.' From the back seat came an exasperated sigh. 'No, Mom, I meant, what important job do you want?' He added helpfully, 'Something like a dog washer or a milkshake maker.'" Hines Shaw says, Jesus was right. No prophet is accepted in his own hometown or even her own car. What is our job as Christians, as Christ followers? It's a good question for today, in which we begin the service on this day for our annual meeting with a collect that talks about God governing all things, a day in which, following this abbreviated service, we talk about our mission and our means and hope and how we are doing as a faith community. So how are we doing? Well, it's up and down, right? It's been a crazy time, a challenging journey, as if we didn't have enough challenges already. Pastors can deal with a lot of hardship. People call when things go wrong frequently. Cancer, depression, accidents, worries about many things, relationship issues, etc. But this heaviness is not just borne by the clergy. The whole parish helps to bear the burdens of being a loving, caring, sacrificial, compassionate body. We show up, even in a pandemic. We show up with sandwich making for the homeless and the hungry. We're a presence with prayers and calls and texts and meals, encouragement, donations, supporting other nonprofits that are helping the hurting, etc. We also, therefore, celebrate the good in the midst of the burden. So-and-so is better. Nikki's prognosis is very promising. Lynn's bones are healing, but she also has this brand new sense of a holy dependence. Ron is doing better, etc., etc. I received a call from a parishioner this week, someone who had participated in a Zoom with the wider Episcopal Church around racism. And she was part of a breakout room, the small group online gathering as part of this program with other random participants. And one of those others was Episcopal rector of Raleigh, North Carolina, Reverend Jamon Taylor, who happens to be black, who at some point in that small group mentioned his own experience of racism over the course of his life, even as an Oxford student, even as a Stanford University student in Palo Alto, California. The St. Mark's parishioner was intrigued and later had an hour-long conversation with Jamon Taylor, in which he spoke about how he attended St. Mark's Episcopal Church as a Stanford student around 2003 and found it to be a welcoming place, a place in which he was mentored by the clergy, a place in which he was confirmed by the bishop, a place in which he participated in programs and the reading of the Passion of Jesus on Palm Sunday, a place in which he played trumpet, added his musical gifts, and a place that he was able to invite his friends who were black to this mostly white community, knowing that they would be seen and heard as human beings, as fellow followers of Christ. Jamon's spiritual journey later led him to the priesthood, and recently, as a nominee at a young age, a nominee in a bishop's election back home in South Carolina. He did not happen to win that election. When I pray for people in a bishop's search, I pray not that they'll win, but that God's will would be done. But I think Jamon can relate to Jesus in today's gospel going back home and not winning that election. Relate to Jesus to some degree. But what I reveled in as the rector of a church, as I listened to the St. Mark's parishioner report this conversation, what I reveled in was this, that he was welcomed. It seems simple. That he was nourished. That he felt he could invite his friends to be here and be absolutely welcomed. That he was grateful. I hadn't thought of him in years, frankly. But this is what I call the holy water syndrome, the ripples of baptism syndrome of someone participating in a faithful community, and those ripples of grace extending and cleansing and lifting up the whole community because of who is gathered there and their stories and their honesty and their hope. So Jamon was inspired by that graceful presence, thanks be to God, in this place, and went on to be part of other communities and is now the spiritual leader of a faith community bearing witness to the way of love in a historical parish in Raleigh. Good things happen in the midst of all the challenges, and the Spirit is moving and deepening and changing the world, and we forget about this good news when inundated with all the bad news. But we are all called to be leaders in this way. Jamon Taylor did not allow the very real and fatigue-creating experiences of racism, a personal history shared by other people of color, facing an ongoing, lifelong, experiential pandemic of racism, of being treated differently simply because of, consciously or unconsciously, the color of his body. Even at times within the church. Did not allow that to keep him from moving ahead in faith and becoming part of a faithful solution by speaking the truth in love. And that love included teaching others by simply speaking the uncomfortable truth, just as Jesus does in his hometown in the gospel today, pointing out the truth that God led their holy prophets to heal foreigners, others, kings and widows before their own were healed. We are all called in this way to tell the truth. A week ago, Tuesday, at the All Ministry meeting, Debbie Thomas and I taught about being a self-differentiated leader. That is, someone who has boundaries, someone who has a sense of self and principles integrity, but who can also connect, who can listen, who can engage with others. Someone, in the words of Edwin Friedman, who, quote, can remain a modifying, non-anxious, and sometimes challenging presence, who can manage his or her own reactivity of others, and therefore be able to take stands at the risk of displeasing, end quote. That sounds like Jesus in today's gospel to me. That sounds like a good place to be in today's world. It sounds like a good way to follow Christ. It sounds promising in a hurting world. It sounds like good news. Moving past fatigue, past anger, past fear, through all that to truthfully be in a place of strength, of change, of hope, of staying the course, like Jesus, staying radically compassionate. Integrity and compassion. May we all walk through the crowds that we find ourselves in, like Jesus, listening and striving simultaneously to be courageous followers of a divine and life-changing love. In the name of Christ, amen.